Hey everyone, welcome back to my second and final Game of the Year 2021 video. In my last video, I covered both old games that I played this year and honorable mentions of games that were released this year. If you didn't watch it, I'd recommend doing so. Today, I will be going over the top 10 games of this year. As a reminder of the guidelines for qualification that I went over in my last video, every game on this list is both a game that I finished and something that came out this year in some way, though I take a very broad definition of what that means. So if a remaster or a remake of an old game came out this year, that counts. If an updated version of a game originally released within the last few years received a wider release this year, that counts. If a game came out in Japan only previously and finally received a release in this region, that counts. For me, many of the most exciting games that came out this year had been previously released to some degree, so I just want to make sure that I make that clear right away, as even the number one game on this list is an example of this. Before I begin the countdown, I figured I'd just briefly mention a few games that are not on this list because I just haven't played them yet. I figured that these are worth mentioning because they're all a part of series that I love, and it would probably be expected that these games might end up on my list, but as it turns out, there are a lot of games, and one person can only make so much time to play them. So here's some games that may end up on my old games list next year. First, I will mention Metroid Dread. While I'm one of those weirdos who loves the Metroid Prime games a lot more than the traditional 2D entries in the series, I nevertheless consider myself to be a big fan of Nintendo's most perpetually neglected franchise, and everything that I've heard about it suggests that this is a very strong one, so I'm looking forward to playing it soon. Next is Lost Judgment, which is a game I'm actually currently playing, but have a pretty long way to go before I see credits. And to be clear, this is not a Yakuza Like a Dragon situation where I was so disappointed with the game that I never actually ended up finishing it. So far, I'm loving Lost Judgment, and I particularly find the addition of the school stories to be a very fun series of side quests about becoming the advisor of every club in the Yokohama high school the game's main plot revolves around. It's a great game, though I guess that the Yakuza and Judgment games are just such a known quantity to me at this point that I didn't necessarily feel compelled to get to it right away. A game that one might expect to show up on this list, given my love for Persona 5 Royal last year and a certain game that shows up on this incoming top 10 list, is Shin Megami Tensei 5. I'm really excited to get to this game, but it just came out right at the time that I was wrapping up Tales of Arise, and I didn't have it in me to go straight into another long-ass grind-heavy JRPG right away. Plus, I just recently bought SMT4 on the 3DS, and I kind of want to play that one first. Another very recent release that I haven't found time yet for is Final Fantasy XIV's latest expansion, Endwalker. I'm really hyped for this game because it's the first expansion that I'm actually all caught up with the MSQ in order to play at launch, but because it really only released a few weeks ago at a time that I was scrambling to wrap up any games that I started earlier in the year and wanted to include on this list, it hasn't happened yet. And at this point, server overload is such a serious problem that they've temporarily taken it off of stores, proving that it is indeed possible to be too successful. And it's probably for the best that I decided to hold off for the time being. Best of luck, Yoshi P. Speaking of Final Fantasy, easily the most baffling game to not end up somewhere on this year-end list is Final Fantasy VII Remake Episode Intermission. I adored the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and this Yuffie-centered DLC came out all the way back in June, and I bought it at the time, and it's only supposed to take like 5 hours, and yet, despite all of that, I've yet to actually sit down to play it. I have no excuse for this. I can only apologize and vow to do better. There's a ton of other games I wish I had time for this year. Kenna, Bridge of Spirits, Psychonauts 2, Adios, Mundawn, Get in the Car Loser, Fatum Batula, Fantasian, Boyfriend Dungeon, Eastward, Forza Horizon 5, Halo Infinite, Black Book, Resident Evil Village, Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury, Age of Empires 4, Necromunda, Guardians of the Galaxy, Chernobylite, Wildermyth, Sable. The list goes on. Oh well, maybe someday. All right, let's get on with this top 10. The first game on this list is Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. We're over a year removed from the launch of the PlayStation 5 at this point, and so far the one game that really stands out to me as something that feels next gen is Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, one of the most gorgeous games in recent memory. Sometimes I think the detail this game manages to create in its environments can actually occasionally be almost too much. The early level Nefarious City is an example of an environment so busy with particle effects and small moving parts it can feel a bit overwhelming, which, to be fair, could be part of the point. Most levels fare much better, such as Blizzard Prime, a showcase not only of the PS5's obvious capabilities of rendering very pretty pictures, but maybe even more impressively, its ability to instantaneously conjure new environments with no noticeable load times, a gimmick the game makes a full mechanic out of with rift warping, or in the case of that particular level, time shifting in the vein of Titanfall 2's Effect and Cause or Dishonored 2's A Crack in the Slab, a trick I am always a sucker for. Outside of its impressive tech, Ratchet & Clank is a very good, if not somewhat old-fashioned, 3D platformer. This is a series that, for whatever reason, I've never previously gotten to, and Rift Apart served as a fantastic introduction. The tight controls, clever and varied level design, and plentiful weapon and upgrade options made for a delightful experience that I 100%ed and still wanted more of. The story is surprisingly well written and affecting, even if it runs at the unnatural breakneck pace of children's media that seems to be made under the anxiety that if stuff isn't constantly moving or exploding, the viewer will get bored, leaving a frustrating lack of breathing room in the otherwise well-executed cutscenes. I also would have loved more open-ended levels like Savali, which offers a large environment to explore in a pseudo-open world kind of design. Nitpicks aside, this is the only game I platinumed this year, and considering how rare of an effort that continues to be for me, it should serve as a pretty good indicator of how thoroughly I enjoyed the experience. In the number 9 spot, I've got Life is Strange True Colors. Besides the first episode of Life is Strange 2, which I enjoyed but never got around to the subsequent episodes of, this was my first playthrough of a Life is Strange game. It didn't take long to be swept up in the story of Alex Chen, a young woman who is afflicted with the supernatural ability to absorb the emotions of the people around her as she tries to settle in the idyllic Colorado mountain town of Haven Springs. Similar to how I understand the earlier entries in the series are, this game is painfully sincere in a way that can be both very charming and cringe-inducing. The characters are well written and fantastically acted, making them exceedingly easy to fall for and root for as they try to both navigate their lives and feelings for each other and also fight against the mining company threatening the safety of the town. Life is Strange is a series known for blending supernatural aspects with otherwise grounded slice-of-life settings and storytelling, but for both better and worse, True Colors is pure fantasy. Here's a small, tight-knit community happy to embrace you as a valued member. You can choose between two love interests, the local radio DJ Steph or park ranger Ryan, though it's frankly hard to imagine not choosing Steph. You and your friends spend time LARPing and hosting town events and playing music. There's a strong 2000s indie movie vibe in a way that is, again, very cheesy and very endearing at the same time. The moment you and Steph cover Blister in the Sun at the town festival is a perfect example of this. It's a warm blanket of a fantasy world to inhabit, and as such, it's very successful. That fantastical tendency also tends to kneecap more serious messaging the story might want to engage in, though. This is a world where powerful corporations buckle under the pressure of stern requests from the community, and police do the right thing when they're simply reminded of what the right thing is. The game clearly wants to say some things about issues of power and systemic corruption, but isn't willing to commit to anything that resembles reality in regards to these structures. To its credit, it's not as though it mishandles all its more serious subject matter as long as it's more in the realm of the personal rather than the political. It's actually pretty powerful in its depictions of grief and the ways that different people process it. Life is Strange presents a temptingly ideal world that can be borderline therapeutic to inhabit as long as you understand its limits. Next up is Boomerang X. It wasn't too long ago that it seemed to be taken for granted that first-person perspectives were not ideal for replicating fine motor skills. 2016's Doom may have been the game that challenged this assumption, and last year's Doom Eternal greatly expanded on the challenge, declaring that jumping and dashing and platforming and ledge grabbing can, in fact, all feel great in first person. I also played a demo of a game called Enchain this year, an experience that had me vibrating with the joy of swinging around in first person, making it my current most anticipated game. And to hold me off until then, I had Boomerang X, a short but sweet horde-based arena FPS where your only weapon is a magical boomerang. A number of upgrades are allotted to your boomerang throughout the game, making it not just a weapon that you throw at enemies and then retrieve, but something that can zip you to its position, that can slow down time as you aim your shot in the air, and can power up shotgun or sniper rifle-like abilities in your offhand. It really can't be oversold how good it feels to do all of this. Flying around arenas, taking out enemies in frantic bullet time like a badass Matrix character, finding ways to line up or organize groups of enemies to eliminate them in more efficient moves. It all just made me feel so cool, and for its modest running time at least, only gets better the more practice you have juggling your repertoire of abilities and testing their limits. It's a flawless set of mechanics employed perfectly, even if that's about all it is. There's little level design or story to speak of, which isn't something I'd hold against a game if that's simply not in its scope, but it's worth noting at least. Boomerang X went down easy and didn't particularly compel me to return to it, but it definitely made for a very fun way to spend a weekend afternoon. Number 7 on this list is one that I hinted at earlier, and that's Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne HD Remaster. Despite the fact that I never got around to playing the actual new SMT game they put out this year, I did play this remaster of the classic PS2 game that they put out in the months leading up to it, and was pretty blown away by it. I had never previously touched this series, and it introduced me to not only what had been a major series blind spot, but basically an entire genre blind spot, as I've never really spent a whole lot of time with true dungeon crawlers. When I think of JRPGs, I tend to think of beautiful, colorful worlds, vibrant and likable characters, and catchy and emotional music. Given those expectations, Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne was pleasantly jarring in presenting a moody, lonely experience. You spend much of the game exploring post-apocalyptic Tokyo alone, save for your party of not particularly chatty demons you recruit along the way. What characters you do meet range from nefarious to benign but creepy, and they all want to talk esoteric philosophy with you. The art is gorgeous, but stark and muted. The music is largely composed of ambient synths, minimalist electronica, gloomy piano pieces, and severely compressed hardcore tracks. Most of the running time of the game is spent exploring increasingly labyrinthine dungeons and fighting waves upon waves of tense turn-based battles. Gameplay-wise, it's the kind of thing that I might expect myself to bounce off of after a handful of hours, but I found both the atmosphere and dungeon crawling itself to be surprisingly compelling. I admit that part of the patience I found for it was probably helped by the merciful difficulty, something I believe was added for this remaster, as the original game is notorious for being very difficult. For what it's worth, I'd call it less super hard and more just kind of brutal in its deployment of RNG. Boss fights are pretty doable as long as you're prepared, but one-hit kills are not uncommon even for random encounters, and if you get hit with one, you'll be sent back to the last time you saved, which can sometimes be a significant amount of time. The merciful difficulty eased this tendency and significantly decreased the amount of grind required, which I was all too happy to embrace, especially in the game's second half. I really appreciate adding modes like this, as it makes a player like me much more willing to engage with a game I might otherwise be too intimidated by to truly appreciate. No matter how approachable they made the combat though, only looking at a guide would have helped me avoid getting the worst ending in the game, and since I wasn't doing that, I stumbled right into a sudden and depressing finale, which, to be honest, I didn't find particularly inappropriate given the sullen mood of much of the rest of the game. If anything, it gave me a reason to one day replay it for a more satisfying conclusion and maybe even commit to the original difficulty. The game in the number 6 spot is yet another updated release of a cult classic JRPG, Nier Replicant version 1.224744871139. It's hard to think of too many games from the last few generations that had more to gain from a thorough polish than Nier. The original American release of Nier Gestalt, a version of the game with a gruff dad version of the titular character because Square Enix assumed the original pretty brother wouldn't go over well with Western audiences. Certainly had its true believers, but in most mainstream conversations was either panned or ignored. Since then, American gamers have largely overcome their embarrassing period of fear of Japanese video game design, and this game's sequel, Nier Automata, captured the hearts of a much wider audience, many of whom, including myself, are eager to experience more of creative director Yoko Taro's particular brand of philosophical and emotional storytelling. To this climate arrived Nier Replicant version 1.224744871139, a game that not only updates the aging PS3 graphics of the original, but restores Brother Nier to his protagonist role, cleans up the combat to match that of Automata's, expands upon Keiichi Okabe's iconic score, and takes a fresh crack at the localization and voice performances. Between the significant work undertaken to refurbish the game, which was always a bit rough around the edges, and the fact that we were already primed for more Nier, the release of this game hit less like a re-release of a decade-old game and more like a brand new and hotly anticipated release. Playing this game, I kept coming back to a surprising question. Do I actually like it more than Automata? In many ways, it's a more accessible work. Automata's characters were by their nature difficult to love, and the story takes a long time to convince you why you should care about it. Replicant's appeal is immediate and self-evident in its story of a kid willing to do anything to save his sister, and only becomes more endearing with the introduction of Grimoire Weiss, but especially Emile and Kaine, who quickly became two of my all-time favorite video game characters. I mentioned the voice acting before, and I just need to note that Laura Bailey's performance as Kaine has to be some of the most entertaining voice acting I've witnessed in a game. Just incredible stuff. Themes of found family are maybe more familiar and less profound than the heady ambitions of Automata, but they're done so particularly well here that it's hard to not fall in love with it. There are areas where the experimentations in form feel more like a test run for Automata 2. Much like that game, seeing credits for the first time means you're still far from finished if you intend to see the full story, which manages to flip everything you think you know about this world on its head multiple times over. But whereas Automata's subsequent playthroughs feel sufficiently like entirely different games, Replicant has you play through significant portions of basically the same exact thing several times over in order to receive chunks of new content. This is something I would have expected to be more frustrated by than I was, but for whatever reason, I was happy to do whatever this game asked of me. I even completed all of the mostly unnecessary side quests, including one that required multiple real-time days of planting and waiting to fulfill. The music and characters are just so strong that I was willing to spend a lot of hours of repetitive gameplay to spend a little more time in this world. That might not make it the revelatory feat of genius that Automata is, but it does make it some of the most successful video game comfort food I've experienced in a long time. Next on this list is Northern Journey. Sometimes you pick up a game on a whim, and it turns out being so incredibly and specifically your shit that you're both angry more people aren't talking about it and protective of it, that this is my little game made for me, and the fact that I see no discourse about it is part of what makes it so special. Last year that was Post Void for me, this year it's Northern Journey. I didn't hear anyone hype this game up on a podcast or see any reviews on websites. I happened to see one tweet by a random person one day saying they were enjoying this game, and then I don't think I ever saw anyone say anything about it again. But that tweet happened to come at just the right time where I was ready for a new game and uncertain what to get. It was only $12 and sounded surprisingly meaty for its asking price, so I bought it and started playing it that day and spent the entire rest of the day compelled to keep playing it. I'm not quite sure what to compare this game to. I've seen some comparisons to Stalker and Pathologic, but I haven't played those games, so I wouldn't know. I'll say that the feeling of atmosphere and the controls can be reminiscent of an Elder Scrolls game, and the experience of navigating a mostly linear but still large and interconnected enough world to give you a sense of exploration and discovery sometimes gave me the same feeling that Dark Souls level design does, but neither of those comparisons really fully works to explain the design of this game, coming as it does by a single first-time developer from Norway, a fact that both explains its idiosyncrasies and continues to astound me, considering the scale of this thing. The creator has been releasing devlogs on YouTube under the name Slid Studios, providing insights both into the creation of Northern Journey and his new project, all of which I find utterly impressive given that he seems to have entirely learned how to use Unreal Engine through the creation of this game. Northern Journey begins with your character's boat being sunk by someone called the Traveling Flute Player, who sets you on a path to do their bidding as you navigate a strange, beautiful, and terrifying land. The story in this game is sparse and kind of silly, serving mostly to give you just enough hints to figure out where to go and what to do next. The combat is something I can imagine putting a lot of people off, but it really just instantly clicked with me. You pick up a lot of weapons through your exploration, all of which have their own brand of sluggish weight to them. Your starter weapon, the slingshot, almost feels like a joke at first, as it takes so long to load each stone and wind up your swing, but once you get used to it, you realize you can do some actual damage with it. Most subsequent weapons are more useful, but all of them are cumbersome in their own unique way. Reload times between shots can be interminable, giving each shot a desperate tension, especially with how numerous and quick enemies can be. I wasn't exaggerating when I said this game was terrifying. Though I might hesitate to call it an outright horror game per se, it taps into fears in an incredibly visceral way. I'd recommend simply not playing this game if you have a fear of spiders, as you'll be fighting multiple varieties of giant ones throughout it, and they are so goddamn creepy. The way they can sneak up on you and overwhelm you and crawl all over you. Similarly, there are some underwater portions of the game that got pretty intense claustrophobic reactions from me. Each new section of the game feels unique, deliberately authored, and well thought out, fully exploring the possibilities of what can be done and seen with the limited mechanics you begin with. Sometimes you brush up against those limits. My most consistent complaint was the way I sometimes got stuck to geometry. For some reason, occasionally when you back into a tree or rock or something, you just stick to it, no matter what direction you try to go. This isn't usually a huge deal. It's easy enough to take a few seconds to finagle your way out of it, but sometimes you don't have a few seconds to spare when multiple enemies are converging on you. The occasional frustrating death occurs from this, but it's easy to forgive small quality of life issues like this with the knowledge that one guy made this whole thing that for the most part works exactly as intended and is so packed with creative, evocative, and strange ideas. Occupying the number 4 spot is The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. Earlier, I called Nier Replicant video game comfort food, and as I mentioned at the beginning of my last video, comfort food is exactly the kind of experience I sought out in this year of gaming. I don't think I played a game this year that earns that title quite as well as The Great Ace Attorney Chronicles. It's a spin-off of Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney, a courtroom drama/detective adventure game series I dearly love, directed by Shu Takumi, creator of the original trilogy. It's an expertly handled localization and repackaging of a 3DS duology from a few years ago that had previously only been available in Japan. It has a historical setting taking place at the dawn of the 20th century in both Japan and England. It has a royalty-free anime version of Sherlock Holmes named Herlock Sholmes. I rarely let myself get overly hyped for games before they're released, but this was a game I just knew was going to be one of my favorites of the year the moment it was announced. Once I finally got my hands on it, it turned out to largely be everything I wanted it to be and more. The mystery stories are engrossing, the characters are endlessly lovable, the music is catchy and adds just enough era and setting appropriate details to give it tons of character. The gameplay mechanics are perfectly crafted, whether it's the tried and true cross-examinations where you break down testimonies by pressing upon statements and presenting evidence, all of which is ripped straight from the very first Phoenix Wright game, or the new additions, such as Summation Examinations and the always fun Dance of Deduction, wherein you help nudge Herlock Sholmes' wild speculations toward a decidedly more logical conclusion. It's also easy enough to come up with gripes. My most consistent one was the relatively slow pacing, which wasn't helped by the inability to speed through dialogue. Additionally, while the original games had a surprisingly biting political bent, the game very nearly literally took an ACAB stance in its portrayal of prosecutors. The nature of this game leaves it feeling a little softer on that end. It does deal pretty regularly with the racism that these Japanese visitors to Victorian England face on a personal level, but reserves more systemic critiques of the justice systems or imperialist natures of either country until literally the very end of the second game, burying its commentary behind a last-minute plot twist. Notable as these complaints may be, I never really found my enjoyment of the game was hindered by them. With the two games, Adventures and Chronicles combined, this is a nearly 70-hour experience, making it long enough that, knowing my attention span for games, especially this year, I might worry I'd get tired of it well before seeing credits. Instead, it was something that I took great pleasure in partially binging through, putting down for a while, and picking back up for more goofy but heartfelt courtroom drama. It's telling that after spending months getting through this massive compilation, the second I finished it, I found myself hoping they'll eventually make sequels about Ryunosuke's continuing lawyering adventures. If they ever do, I'll probably be even more excited for it than I was for this collection. All right, we are now down to the top 3. First up, we've got Inscription. I think I have the potential to love deck builders, roguelike or otherwise, but I'm so often intimidated by them. The time it takes to learn the rule set, build out a powerful deck, grok the higher level strategies, and reach the end of games like these usually requires investing at least a few dozen hours of trial and error, something I'm rarely willing to devote to this style of game. Inscription, Daniel Mullen's horror deck builder escape room game, became a sensation this year because of its promise of genre-bending, fourth wall-breaking gimmicks. It's the kind of game that gets sold on word of mouth. Though being published by Devolver Digital certainly doesn't hurt. The kind that someone tells you, don't look up anything about it, just trust me, play it, to maximize the unpredictable surprises it has in store. That kind of talk is certainly what got me to pick it up, though I doubt I would have stuck with it if I didn't find the card game at its heart to be a perfect little deck builder in its own right. It's a simple game, one that only takes a few minutes to basically understand and only a few hours to have enough mastery over that you're able to exploit certain mechanics to your favor, as the game seems to expect you to do. Just as you're starting to feel like you've broken your way out of the challenge, it drops a massive story bomb on you, and when the smoke clears, you're suddenly playing what is, for all intents and purposes, an entirely different game. Then, a few hours later, it does it again. The balance it keeps throughout its runtime, from fun little card game to inventive twist to fun little card game to inventive twist, feels expertly paced. The whole thing only lasts a little over a dozen hours, and by the end of it, I felt like I'd gone on a hell of a trip. Many of the most entertaining tricks and even mechanics and presentation that this game pulls are best left unsaid here, and I've already gotten all the rants out of my system about some of the utterly delightful late game boss fights to my friends who were willing to be spoiled, so I think I'll end this review here by simply saying, just trust me, play it. My number 2 favorite game of this year is Unpacking. This is quite simply a perfect little game. A chill puzzler with a novel premise that is exquisitely paced, satisfying the player's organizational compulsion while telling a surprisingly moving story through its mechanics. The game starts out with a title card that reads 1997, then plops you into a child's empty bedroom with a small pile of boxes that you're meant to unpack as you decorate the room. It's a very fulfilling exercise, and the game strikes a good balance in requiring certain items to go in certain places while also giving you freedom to make the room look how you want it to look. The pixel art is immaculate, replicating dozens of household items in cute, nifty little designs, and the sound editing is shockingly meticulous. Each item makes its own little sound when placed down and makes different sounds depending on what kind of surface it's placed in. It's a beautiful demonstration of the kind of impressive attention to detail that even small dev teams can achieve with good scoping. Once you finish unpacking that room, you're predictably transported to the next level, another room to unpack, but this time the title card reads 2004. And if it wasn't obvious already, you realize that you're following the same person throughout their life by unpacking all the major moves they've made. What was clearly the bedroom of a tween is now a freshman college dorm room. Through the few decades you follow this person, you see her grow up and go through life changes. It's astonishing how much you can tell is going on at each point in her life simply by the spaces she occupies and the things she owns. The game is equally capable of revealing the natures of each player and how they choose to organize their spaces. Are you the type of person that folds and neatly orders your underwear, or do you just toss it all in a drawer? Do you like to sort your books by size, or are they all mixed together? Do you think this soccer ball belongs on the shelf or under the bed, or simply just on the floor? Apparently, even some younger players are confounded by the game's version of a GameCube, assuming that it's a rice cooker or something. It seems nearly impossible to play this game without reflecting on the big moves that you yourself have made. Like, what was I doing if not at this specific year, then at this general age? Who was I living with? Where was I living? What was important to me? Who was I at this particular moment? I found myself relating heavily to a lot of its moments, but also feeling the events I couldn't relate to, recognizing a fleeting moment of regret for experiences I never had as strongly as the moments of recognition and understanding. I'm a sucker for sentimental time-spanning montages, particularly when there's a love story mixed up in there. It's a Wonderful Life, the first few minutes of Up, hell, even the end of Avengers Endgame, that shit always reduces me to a blubbering mess, whether it feels earned or not. So the fact that the end of this game brought me to tears isn't exactly surprising, but the fact that it did so with no dialogue, no on-screen characters, just a few hours of unpacking boxes in one single frame at the conclusion, certainly is an achievement worth celebrating. And finally, my favorite game of the year by a very large margin, probably not a surprise if you watched the video I put out earlier this year, it's Disco Elysium: The Final Cut. To a degree, I don't know if I have a whole lot to say about this game that I didn't already cover in much greater detail in my hour-long review/summary/analysis. 6 months or so later, I'm still so astounded and grateful that this game exists, and happy that the Final Cut released this year more or less perfected what was already an incredibly realized game, and put it back on my radar to finally dig into it this year. With more distance, I've maybe come to appreciate even more than before just how well written this thing is. As someone who both regularly plays video games and is an English teacher who reads and writes often, I think I've learned to temper my expectations in what video game writing can deliver. I don't think the medium is any less naturally suited to good storytelling than any other in theory, but for so many, the writing is just usually not the focus, and even for games where writing is focused upon, it's rare to find one with the depth and power of words that even a slightly above average novel would contain. Given that, the fact that Disco Elysium not only holds up in comparison to the medium of novels in general, but even very good novels, feels like a minor miracle. More than that, I think I appreciate even more now its virtues as a game as well. Most games have fairly well-defined fail states. Just look at early adventure games, the genre that this game shares the most DNA with outside of RPGs. Those games may have had a handful of different endings or outcomes, but when you fucked up, whether by actually dying or simply doing something the developers deemed as out of character or the bounds of the plot, the game ended and sent you back to your last save to try it again. Technically, there's nothing stopping you from doing that yourself if you do something you're not happy about in this game, and I'll admit I occasionally did. But the game rarely forces fail states on you, and in fact feels like it encourages you not to place them on yourself. Tabletop RPG players know the feeling of getting a rotten roll and having shit break tremendously bad. There are usually no do-overs in that setting. You just have to roll with whatever happens. Disco Elysium wants you to have that experience, and plays the role of GM both unflinchingly and creatively. When things go wrong in this game, it's usually not what you want to happen, but the results are often even more entertaining than if you had succeeded. It has an extraordinary ability to make whatever result you received feel like canon. More than anything, though, the feelings it left me with about hope in the face of a bleak future are what will stick with me the most. In January 2020, Waypoint Radio released a Disco Elysium spoiler cast where they engaged in a very long and very enlightening conversation about this game and its various themes. Figuring I would eventually get around to actually playing it, I skipped the podcast. It wasn't until I had not only finished the game, but finished my video about it, that I finally rewarded myself by listening to it. While everyone involved in the discussion loved the game, Austin Walker noted the pessimism so much of the game is mired in. Calling it defeatist leftism, he speculated that the place the game was coming from might already feel somewhat dated as its development was started during the rise of fascist movements around the world. Again, remember that this was January of 2020. He cited the fact that Bernie Sanders' performance in primary elections had so far been very promising as evidence that in America and elsewhere, we were slowly starting to pick ourselves up out of the darkness of the last few years. There are a couple ways that I think it's interesting to reassess that statement in 2021. Obviously, there was COVID, which had already made its way here, but was not the full-blown catastrophe event that it was about to become, and which the Democrats used as but one of many of its tools to bury Bernie's campaign. It's been a long, hard, weird, and depressing couple years, to put it lightly. I wouldn't even know where to begin to recount the horrors we've all lived through between then and now. It's easy enough to argue that 2021 was maybe even a more appropriate time for this game's particular brand of bleak cynicism to resonate with audiences than in the brief period of late 2019/early 2020, where things may have briefly felt a bit brighter than they had in a long time. But another thing that couldn't have been predicted at the time was that the release of the Final Cut and the political vision quests that were added to this version of the game could actually dramatically change one's perspective on its message. As I noted in my video, it's an easy thing to miss, both requiring one to pursue the communist political alignment and complete the series of side quests tied to it, but Like I said earlier, this game has a knack for making your particular experience with it feel like canon, and for me, the final scene with the Mazovian Socioeconomics Book Club was absolutely vital as not only existing as one of my favorite scenes of the whole game on its own, but in reframing the events of the game's final chapter. I won't get into spoilers here, but I will say that I can't see the message of this game as defeatist. Is it obsessed with tragedy and with humans' basest, most selfish, most mean-spirited, and weak and pitiful aspects? All yes, absolutely. And frankly, I think it's hard not to focus on those things in our current climate. But for all the time it spends there, I don't think the game ever submits to it. In fact, I think it definitively rejects it, making the ultimate statement that no matter how dark things may get, and they can and will get pretty fucking dark, it is incumbent upon us to maintain hope, to understand how small and trivial our perspectives are in the grand scheme of the universe, to never stop imagining a better world, and to fight to whatever degree it's possible to make that world a reality. And a game that delivers that message while also feeling like the furthest thing from a fantastical or unrealistic depiction of the dismal state of things is exactly the game I needed to keep me going this year. And with that, I can now say farewell to the past year in games and look forward to another year of spending entirely way too much time playing games, both new and old. Hopefully you got some good recommendations out of these videos. Thank you so much and Happy New Year!